Hi, I'm Jacob Bonta, host of Growth and Beyond. After generating millions of dollars in pipeline value for various companies via fundamental marketing principles and leveraging modern technology, we made this show to interview top business leaders and highlight the ways to achieve growth for your business. If you'd like to level up your customer base and let us help you grow, email me at jacob@lowlandscollective.com. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Growth and Beyond. Today I'm chatting with Kevin Mackey, the co-founder and CEO of 1,000 Zebras, which is a platform that helps you create an infrastructure that allows you to build your business, keep your equity, and have a thriving team of peers and business owners surrounding you. In our conversation, we chat about the most important lessons Kevin learned from having to make unfortunate layoffs while at his previous company, which no one likes to do. The importance of having support from the leaders of your business when things get tough, and what the distribution of talent from the big co's like Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, and what that means for the market. All right, let's get to it. Here's my conversation with the co-founder and CEO of 1,000 Zebras, Kevin Mackey. What's up, Kevin? How you doing? Thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Grateful to be here.
No problem. So do you mind taking a second to say hi to the audience and share something that you believe to be the biggest myth when it comes to growing a business?
Yeah, absolutely. So hello to the audience out there. Kevin Mackey, multiple time startup founder and entrepreneur. And I think that one of the biggest myths of starting businesses is that you have to go from zero to a billion or a gazillion, or that there's really only one way to experience hyper growth or that type of company, and that there's one outcome, which is a successful exit that leads to infinite riches and possibilities. Those things absolutely do happen, but I'm beginning to see how they can happen maybe in different ways than just, I call it the path to infinite growth. This zero to I'm on this path to infinite growth and I'm never going to get off of it. I think that actually there's a lot of variability in how anyone can start and run their business. It's just you kind of have to understand what those paths are, and sometimes they aren't that simple.
Oh yeah, sometimes they're very, very complicated. Depending. This is sort of like a very zoomed out question. But I like to ask every guest this, but can you sort of walk us through your journey to becoming a founder / CEO and how you got started just when it comes to entrepreneurship in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go relatively fast. It's been about 14 or 15 years. I can't really remember at this point, and I'm bad at math. So here we go. I'm going to bring us back to 2007, which was, I guess about a little less than that. But I graduated in finance and accounting into the Great Recession. And that wasn't entrepreneurial in and of itself, but that's where I really kind of taught myself how to learn. I don't know if you ever had the experience after school or a schooling type event where you go through this thing and you're like, yeah, I definitely learned some stuff. And then you get into real world conversations and you're like, I don't really have any idea about any of this. And that was actually how I felt in finance in that 2007-8 timeframe, is all these things that I had just learned. Granted, it was undergrad. I would read the Wall Street Journal and be like, I don't know what any of that means. And so I would spend a lot of time, because I didn't have that many commitments at the time, no kids, no family, where I could just kind of do whatever I wanted. And that thing that I wanted to do was learn all the things that I felt like I didn't know about finance. And I've probably actually forgotten a lot of what I've learned, but what I took with me is the ability to teach yourself just based on the things that are out there, drawing conclusions on legal pad, taking word that you see in the Wall Street Journal and putting it into Google and then Wikipedia, and then figuring out what all of those things mean. You have the tools that are available to you. And maybe I didn't realize that until I got into what I would consider to be the real world, not actually any collegiate experience, but being on my own and taking anything and everything that I had at my disposal to teach myself more about that industry. So that was what ultimately was very entrepreneurial. And I did realize after a couple of years in finance that I didn't want to go down the track that I was on, which was more wealth management, personal financial planning. And so I just lucked into, through a network experience, someone who was starting a business at the time. She was a professor at Northern Kentucky University. And so we started a company called Glue, GLUE. We started that together in the 2011 timeframe. And that was a digital portfolio for undergrads, graduates, young professionals to be able to demonstrate still what I would consider to be your full selves. LinkedIn has gotten a lot better, but still resumes, things like that, they just don't really present yourself in a full, well-rounded way. So that was the company that we started building, and I'll probably reference that quite a bit in this discussion because I learned so much. And ultimately, maybe it was because I was young, maybe a little bit naive, and definitely very ambitious. All of those things are actually a great elixir to just kind of blindly going in and saying, I'm going to start something and I hope that it's going to be successful. And ultimately that wasn't successful, but the experiences that I took from it and that it allowed for me to have, that ultimately was the most important thing. So I don't know that I got started saying I'm going to be a founder and CEO out of anything other than maybe naivete and ambition. But what I learned during the experience actually really shaped me as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, that's amazing. And not to fast forward too much into the future, but and I may be skipping over years from Glue to Coterie, but we've known each other for a few years now, and we originally met while you were at Coterie. I saw that you recently left the company. Is there anything that you care to highlight about that for the audience?
Sure, absolutely. First and foremost, I want to highlight that everything is cool. Like, we're good. I'm a co-founder of Coterie first, always. I care sincerely about the company, the team there, and our success. So for me, this is more about pursuing a passion that I've had for quite a long time, even preceding Coterie in a lot of respects. That being said, there's no way that this could have possibly happened without Coterie because of how much I learned there, not only about the industry building and scaling rapid growth businesses, but more importantly, the aspect of underwriting and how important digital underwriting actually is going to become into many other industries outside of insurance. So not that many industries talk about digital underwriting or things of that nature, but the things that I learned there is extremely applicable to other industries and new businesses. And so that's where my time and my experiences at Coterie absolutely were pivotal in my ability to start this. Furthermore, and I think that this is a testament to founder relationships and having good relationships with your board and other things, we tried to do this on the up and up. I wanted to make sure that I was communicating with my co-founder and CEO and co-founder and chief growth officer, David McFarland and Tim Metzner, respectively, that they knew what my intentions were, that this wasn't something that they get caught in left field of like, oh, you want to start a credit union now? No, we had spoken about this, about the why, about ultimately why I wanted to do this and how there's complements to those businesses, probably about as early as maybe 8 months ago. Because I wanted to be transparent, not to say I'm leaving this instant, more like this is a dream of mine. How can we make this happen? And then we were and are fortunate enough to have, again, a tremendous team at Coterie, and I was able to promote my vice president of operations, Morgan Smith, who's a phenomenal individual and a great professional, into the role of chief operating officer. Had I not felt comfortable having my replacement there and really having her trajectory be tremendous, I would not have done this. You wouldn't have heard this from me because I would have still kept it under wraps only until the point where I had felt that everything at Coterie was good enough for me to actually leave and start something new. So I hope that that's worthwhile for people in your audience, is that maybe sometimes the question isn't do I or don't I? It's more about when is the right time and how do I do things respectfully and with transparency to the point where hopefully it works out and you can say what you want and then get it. And that's, I hope the experience that I just had at Coterie, at least that's been mine.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that's something I feel like a lot of people get hung up on. It's like, well, not hung up, that may be the wrong word, but it's often very challenging to find your replacement. And you mentioned that you found your replacement fairly quickly into the entire sort of trajectory of the company or your time there. That's wild. Now I'm going to shift gears slightly. This is not the most fun question, but I think it's like one of the most important, especially given the current sort of environment in the tech space, right? So there are a lot of layoffs happening right now in tech. And I know that Coterie went through its own sort of rounds of layoffs here and there, just like every tech startup does. Is there anything that you learned through that experience that the audience could potentially learn from?
So much. We could probably do our own podcast on that one, and I even to because I don't want to go in too many different places, but I'm going to actually talk personally about kind of how I experienced it, and then hopefully what we did as founders and as leaders of the company. Because I think that my TLDR answer is, if you treat people with respect and humanity, you'll be able to get through a bad experience. And what we tried to do was make sure that all of the employees that were part of our RIF became employed. And that actually, ironically, includes two great professionals, Karen Sanchez and Schwinn, and I'm forgetting Schwinn's last name. Pardon me, Schwinn, if you're listening to this. They were two of our recruiters that were actually part of our RIF, and we asked for them to stay around around a month longer so that they could place the individuals that were part of the RIF, and then they eventually left the company too. And these individuals were willing to do that, which is just an incredible testament to their professionalism and their maturity. But these are the types of people that we hired, is that we really wanted to bring the best of ourselves and the people that came to work with us, so that these sorts of events, not that you ever plan for these to happen, but when you have to go through hard times, you're able to go through hard times with that same consistency, that same humanity that hopefully was a part of the interview process, when things were positive. The same thing needs to be said for how you approach things when things are challenging and difficult. So that's where I'm actually going to go a little bit into the answer. Personally, I knew that we were going to do this 6 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. I can't remember the exact chronology. It went relatively fast because the economy took a rapid turn last year. But I knew in advance of when we were going to do things, because especially as a founder and as the COO of the company, you need to be prepared. You need to go through things the right way. You need to notify your team in the right order. And so having that knowledge and that thing that's sitting in your gut that feels very bad, it's not a very fun thing to do. So you need to have that support. Again, I talked about the support of David and Tim and others at the business. You have to have that, because as human beings, when we go through these difficult things, you must have the support of those around you. Otherwise, you're taking it to your family. You're taking it home with you. And oftentimes that's going to be challenging too. And so most of the time, then you just by yourself. Those are all very difficult things. So having the support system so that you can talk openly, even vulnerably, about things that are going on difficult with high-level leaders at your business, super important to have. And I think that I'm grateful for the long tenure that we had those relationships, so that when we went through those difficult times, we were able to do it together. So that's the first kind of more personal thing. The second thing, when it comes to the business and how the things that I learned about how maybe to appropriately handle a very challenging situation. I already talked about the first one, which is do your best in a difficult situation to experience humanity and to have that vulnerability. That will relate also to severance packages and things of that nature. So taking care of your people as best as you can. That's not an expectation that everyone's going to love you. It still is a tough situation in which you're telling someone that they lost a job. So you can't ever have the expectation that right in that moment it's going to be hunky-dory and great. But at the same time, I think that when you look at it as all of the turbulence subsides, you can really turn back to yourself and say, truly in the mirror, did I handle this as best as I thought we and I possibly could? And that also relates to how we handled it with the team. It was a very difficult time for the existing team members that saw their teammates be let go. There's lots of nervousness, especially when you see the headlines every day, which is 10,000, 14%. I mean, it doesn't go away. It continues to have this degree of anxiety. So that's where, as leaders, you also have the responsibility to prepare yourself mentally to be vulnerable and say, here's what we did. Here's why we did it. We hoped to get this as right as we possibly could, but I'm sure that there's things that we didn't do. We're open to listening to that. We're open to hearing how you feel about this. This is a moment for us to feel. This is not a moment for us to do anything other than be with each other. We couldn't, and I feel like I actually delivered that almost the way that I would have delivered a statement to the company 8 or so months ago, because we needed to have that genuineness, because if it wasn't, then it all goes out the window. And so that's where I think that long tail of being genuine and really just trying as best as you can. You're not going to get it right all the time, but trying as best as you can to get it right and to be human. It's the best you can do.
Speaking of like the tech companies that do like lay off thousands of employees, what's your take on like, I guess from my perspective, it feels like there's a lot of like tech bloat, if that makes any sense. And those firing thousands of people seems I mean, from if you look at it on paper, it's like, oh, okay, well, this business is about to fail. You know what I mean? But they never do. Um, I don't really know if there's a question in there, but I wanted to get your take on that because that's something I've been thinking about recently. It's just seeing all those numbers is crazy. And then seeing like their bottom line increase. I know it costs money for employees, and that's like you shave off a lot of that, so it helps financially, but I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
I could. All these are going to be opinions. Because similar to you, I'm observing these things. I can speak to our decisions at Coterie or the decisions that I would make in my own companies. But I think that if I'm taking some macroeconomic factors that we've been seeing for the past 10 years, and specifically the supposed quote unquote war on talent. So if we rewind ourselves to even 18 months ago, when it was the perspective was, well, the hiring market is hot. If you want to get talent, you're going to have to pay for it. And it's not that that's an untrue statement, but I think that when you look at it at massive scale, billions of dollars, tens of thousands of employees, and you look at the planning cycles that go into that, it does get easy to say, well, what do we need? We need this and this and this, and it's going to cost us this. And here's what our plans are. And we're the best paying companies. And here's how we're going to recruit. And now the ship is off and it is running. And guess what? The whole war on talent thing changed just when the ability for easy money to come in also changed. And so that's what I think the most important factor is when I look at it, I just see it as this is an unwinding of decisions that typically made at large corporation that I understand is that when you're turning a barge, you have to turn that barge to the best of your ability early. And when the only thing that you're hearing, especially from quite talented people that are geographically located in a place or places or a series of places that might be pretty expensive, relatively speaking, for talent, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get, well, we have to do X, Y, and Z to bring all of these people out, support them. And then that no longer became true, which made it very easy to say, well, we got that one wrong. Sorry. Now, here's actually where I'm going to take this and spin it positively. And I'm actually going to attach my experience in the Great Recession and the learnings that I talked about from then back into today. It's not the same industries, but it's actually a lot of the same numbers, maybe not the exact same, but I remember it was March 17th, 2008. I was 3 months into my first job in the wealth management firm that I told you about. And that was the date that Bear Stearns failed. And overnight, 33,000 people lost their jobs. And so that went on and on and on through the remainder of that year, where you saw hundreds of thousands of people, industry-long professionals that lost their jobs. A couple of things ended up happening as a result of that. And truly, I was one of the beneficiaries. The first is that people that were multi-decade industry professionals, they showed up to work the next day. They just didn't get paid for it. And guess where they put everything? They put it on the blogosphere. So for the first time ever, a person like me who was coming out of school was able to read a blog like Across the Curve. AcrossTheCurve.com, it might not even exist anymore, was a blog in which John Jansen, a multi-year, 30-year industry veteran, lost his job, and he started publishing corporate and interest rate spreads online for free, for nothing, to everybody in the world that knew about it. And so for me, it was basically like I was able to see the things that a New York stockbroker would see before CNBC gets it, but also without the, $1,000 subscription to Bloomberg. And so it was actually where I got to see people lost their jobs, but they were actually able to continue doing what they loved. They just had to do it in a different way. And again, making lots of generalizations. But here's where I see the corollary with tech workers in especially the United States of America. That's only my frame of reference. So I can't speak about the world, but I do believe this is probably somewhat true. When you're not getting paid $500,000 from Google anymore, or an example of that, it means that you can still get paid relatively well in a different location at the top of your industry, in which you basically have no competition. So if you think of the concentration of sheer intellect that was at 5 companies that now had 100,000 people laid off, think about where that's going to get distributed to. And that's when you start to think, oh, yes, I want to be with those entrepreneurs when the thing they start building today starts to hit in 1, 2, 3 years, because it's going to start to be in an industry that is actually maybe not as tech forward as some of the other ones, but they're going to bring that intensity into these industries. And then that's when I think you're going to start to see a generational turnover in how companies are growing and scaling that is not just venture backed. That is actually, it could be venture backed, but I think it's actually going to open up a lot of opportunities for funding sources, for things like credit unions, for groups that are naturally evolving around, I consider it to be shared infrastructure that leads to a shared economic benefit. I think that when you start to look at how can technologists and business people come together and create companies that actually might not need billions of dollars, millions of dollars to run it, maybe they can do it in a different way that allows for them to slowly but surely grow up a business that, again, benefits themselves and society. I think there's a lot of interest in that, and this process is only going to push that further into existence, I think.
So that what you were just speaking to is sort of like it feels like an organic sort of capitalism type cyclical event in which competitiveness almost organically gets spread to other companies. You know what I mean? And no one's really doing it on purpose. And that's why I use the word organic. It's really interesting. I never really thought of it that way.
Yeah. I have to say that part of that came from seeing specifically how venture capital and non-venture capital businesses are built, and then ultimately even seeing the outcome of where money has gone over the past 10 or so years. I'm going to be critical, and I'm going to be very general, and I'm probably going to be incorrect. But when I think about the sheer amount of money that has been in the system over the past decade and where those investment dollars have gone, relatively speaking, from society, I don't think that it's actually produced what that investment should have produced. Hundreds of billions of dollars going into what? Uber? Like, awesome, cool, but is society actually that much better because of it? No. Maybe with AI tools and things like that, hopefully the next 10 years will be more fruitful than other things. But I think that people are going to look at what Salesforce turned into. Now that we look back at the whole thesis of Salesforce is trying to replace Siebel systems, Salesforce is Siebel systems. Who's going to replace them now? And that needs to happen rapidly. And I think that the question or the answer is it's not going to happen in venture capital realms, because that's what we just did. We need something different. And I think that it's actually going to be a group of people, even with myself starting and saying, I can build a huge and solid business, billion-dollar business, national business over the course of the next decade that does not need to return money back to shareholders. It's returning money back to my members. And then once that and things like it start to catch on, there's lots of words for it, cooperatives, but I don't want it to be labeled incorrectly or negatively. I actually think that it's just the actions of business owners that is going to speak. It is going to be the businesses that choose to be a part of infrastructure that makes that infrastructure valuable. And if it's only making a certain percentage valuable, not that capitalism isn't important, I'm going through a company right now that hopefully is going to make me prosperous in whatever sense that means. That's why we started the business, among many other reasons. But now I have the choice to start a non-shareholder based institution. And you're seeing an entrepreneur, hopefully, that I could start a bunch of venture-backed businesses, but I'm not going to yet, or at least that's not my next step. My next step is to try something new. And I actually think there's a lot more of me out there than there's ever been before. And I want to give that person and that group a voice, because I think that it's collectively so powerful. It's not meant to say capitalism is important, socialism, blah, blah, blah. This is not a political conversation whatsoever. It's actually a business strategy that I think that most smaller businesses can buy into. Because how many times can you listen to something or someone that you don't know try to sell you something that you don't need because they want you to get big to the point where you can eventually pay for it? That's just reverse of what I want to have happen. I want to build something for the companies that eventually do grow and graduate out of that thing that we're doing, because they individually can still be a part of the network. Their next business that they start will be a part of the network, even if the current one that they built has graduated and grown out of it. I think that we need to think more like that. And how can we have our boats floating together, as opposed to, I'm just going to run buckshot through you and hopefully you sink, because then I have the whole listen to myself. I don't need the whole ocean. We don't need the whole ocean. We need the ability to work together in it. And I think there's a lot more of me out there than actually there are venture capable businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Speaking of that, something new, what inspired you to start 1,000 Zebras, and how did you develop that initial concept?
Yeah, it was a very specific circumstance. I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but I think that maybe your audience, maybe some of them are like in a business like this. It was a private equity backed company that was kind of part of a trio of businesses. And I've been telling the story recently, and I think that this is true, but maybe I'm just misremembering. I'm pretty sure that 6 payrolls in a row, we had to basically ask, like, please, can we have enough just to make this payroll? It was just the same thing every single time. So that was the course of really a couple of months in a row. And personally, I was younger, so I was a little bit more brash. And I said to the CEO of that company at the time, like, with the way we're moving the money around, might as well just start a damn credit union and have a better way of doing this banking. And it was not a serious comment, and it wasn't a serious suggestion at the time. But I actually never stopped thinking about it. And this was about 7 years ago. And as I started more businesses and was working with more businesses in all kinds of different spheres, and maybe it's my own confirmation bias, but I just kept seeing like this is more and more relevant and necessary every single day. And so the long-term vision for us absolutely is credit union. I love the model of a credit union. I love the idea of a member-based association, but not just a member-based association as a collective, a member-based association around significant infrastructure that has a balance sheet. I think that that is what is so necessary to making this model work. And the more that I went through Coterie and looked at how digitization of an underwriting model is built, I then said to myself, well, we can build this exact same thing, relatively speaking, lots of assumptions here, but we can build the same thing in a different level of the world and eventually kind of have those two models come together. If I can create an underwriting criteria for businesses that are part of a similar-ish group, then that means that I can take that to other partners and we can make that work. It means that we can make a new model work. It doesn't mean that I need to go gangbusters and make sure that I'm monetizing and licensing out my audience forever and ever. It means actually the opposite of that. It means that the more that we have that collective bargaining power, whether it be through group health programs, whether it be through other insurance programs, whether it be through affinity things or just different relationships that you can have with your group buying power, that ultimately leads to the ability for entrepreneurs to operate at a smaller footprint, which leads to dollars in pocket, which leads to more value for network, which leads to the same thing happening over and over again. And that's why I like that model, is that theoretically that can exist as a flywheel.
Boom. Yeah, that's awesome. Were there any key moments or experiences like throughout your entire career that shaped your leadership style and approach to running 1,000 Zebras?
Yeah, lots of them. The first one started at Glue, the company that I told you about previously. And it was a relatively simple learning lesson. As a first-time entrepreneur, I can say pretty affectionately that I had no clue what I was doing, which means that that was the biggest learning opportunity. Is when you don't really know what you're doing, things can feel really far away. Things can feel out of touch, out of reach. But after you go through it, and in particular, even after you failed, you kind of realize, well, that really sucked, and I definitely don't want to do that again. But I always say, like, there's life on the other side of that. No one ever told me, because especially as an entrepreneur, like, you only think about one thing. You think about the success of your business. You know that it's possible and probable that your company is not going to succeed, but you never, ever, ever think that. And as part of that, it also meant that I never thought about what life might look like on the other side of that, which caused a lot of internal stress for me. And so actually being able to learn, this is yet another learning opportunity for anything. I cannot guarantee that 1,000 Zebras or Coterie or whatever other business that I start is going to be successful. But I can control the way that I show up to it and what I contribute and bring into it, or even more importantly, where I'm not focusing my time and attention. Because as that first-time entrepreneur, I tried to think about everything, and that became very daunting. And then on the outside, you kind of look back at what are the things that I actually needed to pay attention to versus what are the things that I really didn't. And that allowance to just be like, yeah, that's important, but it's not important right now. That actually matters significantly to your calm and your presence when you're building up bigger companies. And so for me, what that manifested itself as at Coterie was I'm not an insurance expert. I guess I could say I'm beginning to become that, having founded and being the chief operating officer of an insurance entity. But there's lots of people at that company and in the world that have much more experience in that realm for me. That's perfectly fine, because then it actually doesn't mean that I need to be that. It means that I need to learn how to ask the right questions and listen to the answers. And that's all part of that learning journey, is that if I hadn't gone through those, I probably wouldn't have learned how to listen and let the right answers come in. And at the end of the day, that is what's probably the most important thing, even for me right now, as a new founder, is that I just have to allow for me to say things that I think, but allow for the market to come back to me to say what's actually true. Because if I just constantly moving forward, like, everyone loves a credit union and everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about right now, that's probably untrue. And so I have to actually allow for the world to kind of tell me back what I think that I'm communicating out to society.
That's something that the podcast is like teaching me, is just be a better listener, because I found myself in meetings throughout my career where I like am jumping the gun and almost interrupting whomever I'm talking to, which is like a terrible habit to get into. And it's a lot easier to start when you're digital, I guess. No, but this podcast has really been quite the experience in terms of like just becoming a better listener, because like you mentioned, that is so important. But it almost goes against like at least everything I was sort of brought up around being like a leader type entity, if you want to call it that. You must be leading, so therefore you must be speaking. You know what I mean? And we see that on like TV and like with the president or whatever. He's never just like sitting there with his arms crossed listening. You know what I mean? But no, he should be. Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I do talk about this in some group leadership programs that I run. The act of leadership is also the act of being led. Good leaders lead and allow themselves to be led. And let's use an example of that. And I had to, in some ways, teach myself this as the chief operating officer of Coterie, because I was not and am not the chief executive officer. Now, if I were, my role would have been different, but that the role of the COO isn't to duplicate the CEO. It is to make sure that you are creating a well-rounded environment. And so for me, the act of listening and leading actually in some cases also meant I had to make sure that I was not always, and this is difficult for me and I can't say I always did it, but playing that second in command role. It means that you actually have to be okay being led. But once you are in the dual role where you are leading and being led at the same time, once I kind of came to that revelation, it allowed for me to be a really solid leader of group meetings with other senior leaders, because it meant that I could set the tone, I could offer my opinion, but I didn't need to be the one that was always speaking. I needed to be kind of like you were talking about with the podcast. Like if you can set the situation up, create the right environment, there isn't that much of a difference between running a good podcast and running a good meeting in some respects.
It's true. It's very true. And to pivot slightly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 1,000 Zebras is a relatively new company. And with that being said, how are you approaching the initial stages of building and growing? And what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing? I think this is a super important question for founders that just started something or are on the edge of actually taking the leap and doing that.
Yeah, totally. So first, if you are looking to take the leap out there, congratulations. It's a tough decision to make, but I'm going to answer Jacob's question authentically, but also just hopefully by saying what kind of our go-to-market plan is. Jacob, to answer one of your questions about things that I've struggled with, that maybe is where I'm going to start, because you've heard me just referring to it. I'm kind of struggling with future casting what I want for us to become, and then talking about what we are right now. Because when I talk credit union and long-term stuff, especially because entrepreneurs, they can context switch and go from very long into the future into today. It's like, okay, well, I'm not ready to switch my bank. And as I have some of these conversations, it's like, cool, I don't actually want to have a conversation about switching banks. But the only way that that's a topic of conversation is if I brought it there. So I've actually tried to kind of be more intentional about how I describe it. And maybe I did or didn't do that on this podcast. But I do want to start describing what we are right now, which is a business network that provides access to banking, healthcare, and other important services on demand. Because we are a business network first and always. The credit union is a business network. Just is a business network with a lot of infrastructure that it takes to get there. So I've had to kind of dial back because we also don't even, I just started this about a month ago. So I don't even have the infrastructure yet to be able to bring people into a community. I'm rapidly developing that, where my goal for me and my team internally is that by the end of the month, we have to tangibly get something for entrepreneurs to get into. It'll probably be a basic SaaS type community system, but we have to give something that has our branding on it, that has our workflows, that has our feel to it, because there's just only so many times that you can have a conversation, even with entrepreneurs that are like, awesome, I love it. But if you can't give them that sign up, that momentum gets stalled. So that's what I would say to the audience here, is that it can be difficult to context switch when you're beginning to have a conversation with, maybe it's your target audience, but you have to give them that something that's tangible. And for me, you can't do that right away. It takes time. It takes money. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but there are usually some ways. This would be the whole MVP conversation. There's ways to MVP out there and get something tangibly for your audience to react to, because until that moment, it's really just conversations, and conversations don't always translate into people doing something or people paying for something. And that's where you just got to kind of hold your nose sometimes and be like, we're putting it out there and hopefully we can learn from it.
Oh yeah. Amen. And when you say something tangible, are you referring to like a downloadable piece of content or something to walk away from and use? I mean,
yeah, I guess how I think about that, it actually ties more back to food entrepreneurship for me. So I guess it's more like self-talk, but the answer is yes. For me, it will be a registration, a login, application, a purchase, like the ability for someone to do something. And in my case, it would be something digital. So it would be the click of a button, commitment to do something. But here's the comment that I made. And I actually just posted about this on LinkedIn a couple of days ago. When you are a food-based business, especially at like a farmer's market, people can understand this. You're walking around. Usually people literally have the cash that's in their hands. They're ready to spend. But if I didn't have any samples, if all I had was just something, just like, no, you can't try this. You can only look at it. I bet that I wouldn't have sold even 50% of what I did, because you have to have that placement. You have to give people something to buy, something to taste, something to interact with. Now that's food. And ultimately that did turn into, we need a sampling strategy and make sure that people aren't getting sick and things like that. But it was critically important to our ability to physically be at the farmers markets to complete our sales. And I believe that would always be true. And that's what has stuck with me over a period of time, is even outside of a realm where you can physically have somebody taste something and make that purchasing decision, you have to find any way to synthesize that. And that's where, when I think about assets online, yeah, it could be a website, but it's more like, what's the web experience? How do you, in the most basic but creative way, demonstrate your brand and give people something to interact with? Because I think that customers go to one of two places. They go to, and pardon me if I'm getting a little bit insurance-y on you, but it's like when you buy somebody's insurance, you don't care how long they've been in business. You don't care what their processes are. You just have an expectation that it works. So I think that with certain products and certain industries, like if I started just with banking, my banking couldn't be MVP. It would have to be only MVP to market parity. That's not actually an MVP. So you kind of have to really understand what is truly MVP versus what is MVP for me And then how much are those things going to cost, and what order do you start to introduce them? So for us, it's going to start with that. How do we introduce the idea of a community that people can tangibly log into for free, go through, of course, kind of an application and onboarding process, because this is a community. But at the end of the day, we need to have it be substantial enough that people will appreciate what it's taken to get through, because everybody else has had to do the same. While at the same time, it's not so arduous that you look at it and you're like, there's no way I'm doing that. And so for us, that's what the MVP is it's the MVP run an onboarding process into something that eventually will be a throwaway. Can't suck, can't be a bad experience. But at the same time, it's not going to be relied on to be permanent. It's the learnings in the process that eventually turn into really probably what your real MVP is.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is another pivot, but I've been wondering this question for, I want to say a few years now. And I want to ask you the question because you were in the insurance industry. When it comes to almost any example I use for brand marketing, or what we call in the marketing world, out of market marketing. So customers or potential customers they don't have the cash in their hand looking to buy, to use your farmer market example. Why are insurance companies crushing it so much harder than any other industry when it comes to creative? It's just like, and I mentioned that I use Geico as usually my go-to example. Like a talking gecko makes no freaking sense, but that is the point. It doesn't need to make sense. But then you look at Progressive with Flow, or Liberty Mutual with the freaking emu, and the guy that is like a cop or something, and they have the car. None of it makes sense, but it's all in the insurance industry. Can you provide any insight into why you think that is the case?
Yeah, and it's going to be my opinion, that's for sure. They have huge marketing budgets. I mean, when you think about the way that a carrier sustains itself, it's not startup company that is trying to go from zero to billions. It's you already have billions, you have billions, and you have expectation of more billions that are going to be coming through. And as an executive, presumably a fiduciary person at those entities, you can't make a decision to stop doing that. And so your question becomes, how do we keep our current customers from going anyplace else? And then, of course, how do we get more that comes in? And there's two realms for that. How do we get more that comes in? Huge marketing funnel. Super Bowl ads. And quite honestly, I would not be surprised if they're using a lot of the same data and even the same firms, or a series of the same firms with the same data that ultimately suggests, and they're even being transparent about it now. Our marketing firms are telling us that we need to do this and this and this. I think that that's happening all over, and I think that they're funny and they're creative. And I think that I hope that the people that are doing that are probably well paid, and they're probably party agencies, and there's a lot there. But that's their business model to sustain. And I think that that's actually where you're going to start to see those that are sustaining are going to start to get eroded against. You're going to see the same thing in banking, is that maybe that doesn't mean anything to a multi-billion-dollar company, but eventually it will. And so I do think that it means, number one, long-term, just like you're seeing in tech, you're going to start to see unit economics coming into extraordinary focus in insurance companies that are raising their rates later based on previous losses that they've had. That is going to happen in the insurance game, is that until that there's a known dollar loss amount for things like climate change, no political statement, but there's a fact that losses are getting bigger because stuff is more expensive and the catastrophes are getting larger. That stuff shows up in your prices after the fact with the bigger, more sustained companies. The incumbent companies like Coterie are trying our best within the applicability of the law and everything else to make sure that we, again, as best as we can within the applicability of the law, can get data feeds to get out in front of where the world is going to be going. And I think eventually that means that better data leads to better underwriting, which leads to better loss ratios, which means over the course of 20 to 30 years, again, so many assumptions in the statement, but a startup, soon to not be startup like Coterie, eventually is going to be in the position to buy them. And that's when I think that you're going to see the retirement of those sorts of activities, because we're taking a fundamentally different approach to being in market. Now, maybe we become Siebel to Salesforce. Again, maybe Coterie becomes the new incumbent carrier. And then 20 years from now, someone with a different database is disrupting us. But I would hope that that's not the case. I hope that with data, API, access, good education, sticky loyalty base, I think that actually is where you are going to see digital underwriting companies like Coterie be successful, because once we're in market and our models are working, then it's distribution. Distribution actually doesn't cost as much when you don't have the human underwriters and the human agents that the current carriers have. So you're really starting to see a flip in business models. And I think the flip in business models is what will actually require there probably to not be as much brand advertising. It will probably be more loyalty-based advertising, which I think will cost a little bit less.
And I know we're almost at time, but how can people learn more about 1,000 Zebras or you if they'd like?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking, Jacob. The first is go to 1000zebras.com. And right now we're looking for pre-registrations for entrepreneurs and other small business owners that want to be a part of a new kick-ass thriving network that eventually leads to shared economic benefit. That's the very first thing, is that we want to know who you are so that we can begin speaking to you. The other easiest way is that I'm on LinkedIn. So Kevin Mackey, 1000 Zebras, just shoot me a note. I always want to speak with entrepreneurs, not only because I just personally believe like the things that I speak about and the approach that I bring, it's all about energy transfer. I like to say that I firmly believe, like if there was like a one sentence description of what I believe, it's that I believe that I can take something out of nothing or create something out of nothing through simple energy transfer. Because I do think that's true. And that's what entrepreneurship is that you've got nothing, and then you take this thing and you start to spread this idea to others. And then that turns into the big movement that turns into the big change. And so I really think that it comes back to, we got to talk to each other and we got to say hello. And we've got to say, this is what I like. This is what I don't like. This is what I've done. This is what I've learned. And as we do that more together, I actually think that there's just so much incredible value out of that. And it doesn't need to be bombastic or over the top or even reaching into people's pockets. I want the money to be around this, but I don't want it to be about money. So yeah, it's the pitch that will bring you into me. Reach out, truly, anytime.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, Kevin. I'm looking forward to watching, obviously, 1,000 Zebras grow with you at the helm. So
thanks, Jacob. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Growth and Beyond. I hope you take something you learned from the conversation and apply it to your business today. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you're listening or watching and share it with a friend. And please be sure to tune into next week's episode where I interview another top business leader and highlight ways to achieve growth for your business. See you then. If you'd like to level up your customer base and let us help you grow, email me at jacob@lowlandscollective.com.